He stole $4.5 billion from a country that trusted him blind. Prosecutors call it one of the largest heists in human history. He should be in a cell right now. Instead, he was toasting champagne with Leonardo DiCaprio. He helped fund the very movie that mocked men like him, The Wolf of Wall Street. His weapon was not a gun. It was a wire transfer and a smile. Hollywood's biggest stars lined up to be near him, cashed his checks, wore his diamonds, and looked the other way. 10 years later, he has never spent one night in prison. So how does a man accused of robbing an entire nation vanish into thin air while the world's most famous people beg for his money? What is he hiding, and who is still protecting him? At Wharton, Jho Low was rich by American standards, but poor by the standards that matter to him. He was surrounded by real oil dynasties, sons of Gulf royalty who did not measure wealth in millions but in entire nations. He wanted desperately to belong to that world. He threw parties, he bought bottles, he performed wealth like a costume that never quite fit. Biographers who later reconstructed this period describe one recurring humiliation. He would host lavish nights out, and one of his Middle Eastern classmates, heir to actual sovereign fortune, would look at the bill Low had proudly paid and laugh it off as pocket change. Reporting from that era describes a moment where one of these young royals reportedly waved off Low's spending with a dismissive remark. Something close to, "That's nothing. That is what my family spends before breakfast." It was not said with anger, it was worse than anger. It was said with boredom. That boredom is what broke something inside him. Not poverty, irrelevance. He was standing next to a version of wealth so total it did not need to try. While his own fortune, real as it was, suddenly felt like a child's allowance. In that room, surrounded by marble floors and casual billions, Jho Low was not the biggest man in the world. He was furniture. According to those who studied his psychology afterward, this is the moment his ambition curdled into something darker. He did not want to be rich anymore. He wanted to be untouchable. He wanted access to the kind of money that makes laughter unnecessary, the kind that does not ask permission. If wealth this size could make a person invisible in a room, then real power was not about having money. It was about controlling the flow of money that belonged to people too big and too distracted to notice it disappearing. He walked away from that humiliation with a private, merciless philosophy, one he would spend the next decade proving true. He came to believe that shame is temporary, but leverage is forever. The world does not punish the thief, it punishes the thief who gets caught being small. And Jho Low decided quietly in that room, full of careless billionaires, that he would rather be hated as a giant than pitied as a guest. Picture a giant piggy bank that belongs to an entire country, but nobody is watching who puts their hand inside. That is Malaysia's sovereign wealth fund in 2009. Politicians promised it would build hospitals and highways. Bankers promised it would generate billions in growth. Everyone was chasing the same illusion, a government fund that could conjure infinite capital out of thin air. And in their hunger to look important, every advisor, every banker, every regulator was too busy competing for a piece of the deal to ask where the money actually went. That is the blind spot. Sovereign wealth funds move so much money through so much shell companies and joint ventures that fraud does not need to hide. It only needs to blend in. Jho Low did not see a financial fund. He saw an unguarded vault the size of a nation, and he understood something the entire banking establishment refused to admit. That trillion-dollar institutions are not destroyed by brilliant hackers. They're gutted by a single insider who understands paperwork better than anyone in the room. Reports on this period describe him explaining his logic to a close associate with chilling calm, saying something close to, "Nobody polices a river this wide. They only watch the banks." That single insight was his manifesto. Morality was for people who could not read a balance sheet. So he made his move. Using his access to the fund's decision makers, he engineered a joint venture that looked like foreign investment on paper but functioned as a pipeline. 37% of one signature, that is what it eventually took to redirect the first slice of $1 billion into a private account with his name quietly attached as beneficiary. Nobody in that room realized what they had just signed. The man everyone still cannot fully explain how he vanished afterward had just made his first move on the board, and the board did not even know a new player had joined. Start with a single object, a bank stamp, not a weapon, not a threat, just a small rubber stamp sitting on a desk in Zurich, belonging to a company called Goodstar Limited. On paper, Goodstar was nothing, a private entity with no factories, no employees, no product, but that stamp is what let $700 million of a nation's development fund slide quietly out of a joint venture account and into a private one, disguised as a routine transfer between business partners. This is the first pillar to the machine. Not theft in the movie sense, no masks, no vaults, just paperwork so boring that nobody in the compliance department wanted to be the one to ask a second question. The second pillar operated in a different room entirely, one soaked in champagne and camera flashes. While regulators in Kuala Lumpur saw spreadsheets, Hollywood saw a golden goose. Picture a private jet cabin, soft lighting, a stack of poker chips worth more than most people's houses. This was the illusion the public consumed. A charming young financier funding blockbuster films, gifting artwork, throwing parties that made tabloids weekly. Nobody in that cabin asked where the money originated, because the money behind the curtain was built specifically so that no one would need to. Reports on his approach describe a pitch that worked the same way every time, regardless of who sat across from him. He would lean in, calm, unhurried, and say something close to, "Don't worry about where it comes from. Worry about what we build with it." That single sentence did the heaviest lifting of the entire operation. It gave partners an emotional exit ramp, a way to accept enormous, unexplained sums of money without ever framing it as complicity. He was not asking anyone to be corrupt, he was offering them a story where they were visionaries, and he was simply the man who made visions affordable. The gratitude this created was not performative, it was real. Producers who received financing for passion projects believed they had found a patron, not a launderer. Celebrities who accepted lavish gifts believed they had found a generous friend, not a liability. This is a second case study, weaponized generosity, where every dollar handed out did double duty, buying loyalty and buying silence in the same transaction, so that when investigators eventually came asking questions, the people best positioned to know something looked the other way, because looking closely would mean admitting they had been used. The third pillar was the coldest, because this one was not about seduction. It was about protection through obedience. Money from the fund was allegedly funneled into political campaigns and used to fund a free concert during a tightly contested election, a night of American headline performers playing for free in his home state while the ruling government's popularity was quietly propped up in the background. This was not generosity either. It was insurance. Every dollar spent on political goodwill was a dollar spent making sure the machine kept running without oversight. And when someone threatened to expose the operation from the inside, the same system revealed a darker function. A former employee of a company connected to the network who had tried to leverage stolen internal data to expose the fraud was later arrested overseas and imprisoned on extortion charges. Whatever his motives, the outcome sent an unmistakable signal through the entire operation that anyone attempting to pull back the curtain would not simply be ignored. They would be neutralized through the legal system itself, the same institutions ordinary people trust to protect them. 3 pillars: a paper company that made theft invisible, a curated fantasy that made theft desirable, and a political shield that made theft untouchable. Each one alone might have collapsed under scrutiny. Together they formed something closer to a closed ecosystem, a self-sustaining loop where the money paid for the loyalty that protected the money that paid for more loyalty. Bankers who should have flagged suspicious transfers instead competed for his business. Celebrities who should have asked questions instead posted photos. Governments that should have investigated instead celebrated ribbon cuttings funded by the very same fund being drained. By the time anyone outside the circle understood what was happening, the machine had already achieved something close to full market capture. Every checkpoint that should have stopped him had already been converted into a component of the operation itself. He had not simply broken the system, he had rebuilt it, quietly, piece by piece, so that the system now worked for him. The empire ran on one rule, that money moves faster than truth. In the summer of 2015, that rule broke. A small independent website called Sarawak Report, run by a journalist working out of a cluttered home office in London, began publishing leaked banking documents nobody was supposed to see. Within days, the Wall Street Journal followed, publishing evidence that $681 million had landed in the personal bank account of the sitting Prime Minister of Malaysia. This was not a whisper anymore. It was printed, time-stamped, and impossible to unprint. The walls did not close in slowly. They came from every direction at once. Swiss authorities froze accounts linked to the fund within weeks. Singapore's central bank began stripping the licenses of banks that had processed the transfers. In the United States, the Department of Justice filed a civil complaint so large it became, at the time, the biggest asset seizure in the agency's history, describing the scheme in language usually reserved for organized crime, not sovereign wealth funds. According to people close to him at the time, Low's demeanor changed almost overnight. Calls unanswered for days, meetings cancelled without explanation, associates suddenly unreachable. The man who had spent years mastering every room he entered was now avoiding every room entirely. The Justice Department's own filing did not ask for permission or offer him a chance to explain. It simply stated its conclusion in writing that the fund had been the target of a massive fraud and money laundering conspiracy, and that officials, quote, systematically embezzled and misappropriated more than $4.5 billion. There was no dramatic arrest, no perp walk, no flashing cameras, just silence. He did not surrender, he disappeared. And in a courtroom he never entered, in a case he still refuses to answer, the government moved forward to seize everything with his name attached, whether he showed up to defend it or not. You wanted a cell door slamming shut? Instead, the story ends with a pardon request sitting quietly on a desk in Washington, filed by lawyers on his behalf, still unresolved. The champagne toast from the beginning never actually stopped. It just moved to a room nobody can locate. Somewhere, reportedly in a city he was never supposed to reach, he is still allegedly useful to someone. So ask yourself honestly why this man was never caught in a nightclub, an art auction, a film premiere, surrounded by people whose jobs was supposedly to notice things. He was not invisible, he was convenient. Every banker, every celebrity, every institution that took his money chose comfort over curiosity and called it trust. The truth was never hidden, it was simply more profitable to look away.